Hannah thought I'd been shot, so she ran into her grandparents' house, like, Cameron's been shot, Cameron's been shot. What made it harder for me, and this gets at the emotional side, is that there was a darker kind of force that was overtaking me that really didn't care about other people. But I needed to find more than something. I needed to find someone. And so this connects Chelsea. I found someone. But then ultimately it connects God to the whole thing, because I found not just a mysterious force, but a personal God, a subjective power near and dear and available to all.
Welcome to Church with Chris. I believe this is episode 10, Big 10. You got a good spot. Episode 10, that's strong. I want to welcome you again to the YouTube channel if you're back another time, if it's your first time. So glad you're here. If you're listening through audio on Apple or Amazon or any place that you listen, Spotify, the podcast can be found there too. So check out those other platforms. I would love for you to like, subscribe, do all the things, leave a rating and review because that's really, really helpful. If you like these conversations, I would also encourage you to go revisit other conversations if you haven't heard those either. I've had a lot of great guests on. I have another great guest today. His name is Cameron Fathauer. Just an awesome guy I have with me today. I'm really, really blessed to have you in my life and just have you as a friend. And so I want to continue to hear your story. And I like to give people a platform who I think give Jesus a platform. And so that's ultimately what we try to do at Church with Chris. We really try to bring conversations to the forefront of people's minds that the internet can be encouraged through rather than like devolving into, right? So it's just this endless pit of like garbage. And so if we can add anything for the kingdom of God, that's kind of the goal. And a lot of times I like to do that with the guests we have on who are professionals in their field, or they're just representing Jesus so well in their workplace, in their vocation, in their ministry, things like that. And so one thing I did want to mention too, by the time this recording comes out, I'm part of a band called Columbus Collective. We do worship nights and worship events in Columbus, Indiana. It's just a bunch of musicians and worship leaders, guitar players, things like that, who serve at their own local churches, and we all get together and we put on these worship nights for the community, and it's just a special thing that we get to do, and we're releasing our first song on I believe it's September 6th. So it's probably already out by the time this airs. I'm not sure when that'll be. But also, I want to invite you to Worship Night in Columbus on November 9th at North High School. The first year we did it 2 years ago, North High School was amazing. It was so cool to be in a gathering of 1,000 people just singing praises to Jesus, and I would love for you to go. So check that out. Check out the Columbus Collective Facebook page, Instagram, all that stuff, and look out for our first original song that's coming out. It'll also be playing on the radio, Bridge FM, that same day that it comes out, which is awesome. That'll be a really cool feeling. So enough about me. I want to introduce Cameron Fathauer to you guys. Cameron and I go pretty far back. Like, I've known you most of your life.
You've known me since I was born, pretty much.
Yeah, like through your family,
Right.
through growing up at CCC, Community Church of Columbus in Columbus, Indiana. And it's just been a joy, man, to watch your journey. It's just been, you have one of the craziest stories. But I think your life was so interesting just from the get-go. I'm friends with, both your brothers, your sister, your parents, who helped us plant a church in town, that kind of thing. And it's just been cool to get to be close to your family for a really long time. Like, y'all are just so legit, have just been pointing people to Jesus for a really long time. And I've seen different versions of that, throughout y'all's lives. And so, yeah, getting to be led by your parents in a lot of ways has just been a blessing too. And your brother does my taxes still. So, that's a blessing once a year.
He's good for something.
He's good for something. He's good for a lot of things. Bryce, you're good for a lot of things. I love him. Yeah, I love Bryce to death. So why don't you, we have a history, but other people don't know you. There's a lot of people that are going to be listening to this episode that aren't from Columbus. They don't know your story. They don't know the history of what has happened to you throughout your life. They don't know your growing up, your interests. They don't know about the accident that you had. And the more I talk about the accident, I would even write it in the questions that I sent you. And I was like, well, was it an accident? I even had a hard time, especially after you writing this book. So we're here today to talk about Cameron's life, but we're also going to talk about his first book, Saving the Subject. So we're going to talk some about that here in just a little bit. I've got a lot of very specific questions to ask about the book and just the process and all that. But it's just, you've had an amazing journey. So Cameron, if you want to introduce yourself, I think the introduction that I could give for you doesn't do justice to what's brought you here today specifically, but also just to this point in life. So, yeah, man, take it away. Tell us from kind of before the accident, who you were, what you were about, and then kind of the whole story of the car wreck and everything that's really shaped your life up to this point.
Sure. Well, Chris, thanks for having me. My name's Cameron Fathauer, and I'm pleased to be here. And it's been quite a journey. So it was during my senior year of high school at Columbus North High School when I was hit by a car as a pedestrian. So it's almost 9 years ago, September 18th, 2015. When I was hit by the car as a pedestrian, I was on a longboard, skateboard, and on this skateboard, hit by the car, immediately entered into a coma. I was lifelined via helicopter from Columbus, Indiana to IU Methodist Hospital, where I was diagnosed with a severe diffuse axonal brain injury down to my brainstem. Remained in a comatose state for 2.5 weeks. Woke up, had to relearn just about everything, including how to walk, talk, do everything over again. The worst part was I had to remember the name of my fiance, Chelsea, who I proposed to a month prior. So yes, I was 17, she was 19 when I asked her hand in marriage. And so she lived out the marriage vows, and she's a huge player in my story, was Chelsea and our relationship and her living out those vows before they even started, waiting for me to wake up. And she said things, people were like, we understand if you don't want to be with him anymore, you guys are young and we understand. And she said, no, I'd push him in a wheelchair for the rest of my life if I had to. And so she's just been so committed to me, and that's a huge aspect of the book and a huge aspect of just my story is Chelsea. So I went through rehab in Indianapolis, and my physical recovery progressed rapidly. So I left rehab a lot sooner than expected. But when I got home, I kind of found myself on a different planet that I had not experienced before the accident. But I guess you were asking me about my life before the accident mainly. So
yeah, because I got some specific questions about
Right.
about the accident and on.
Yeah, because I've shared this story a number of times,
Yeah.
and so I can get going with it,
Yeah.
and then it kind of gets out of control. But
We got time.
right, so before the accident, it was all basketball. Basketball was my identity growing up in Columbus, Indiana. So all the way until my junior year of high school is when I really started feeling a call to ministry. So I felt a serious call to ministry. I was taking classes online at the Southern Baptist Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, dual enrollment program. It was great. I was speaking on the radio once a month with WYGS, Jim Hudson, who recently passed away, wonderful guy, and Jim Pursley, Pastor Pursley. And so we were speaking on the radio together, and I was blogging. And so I've always enjoyed writing, and that's been a way for me to process the faith and process my experiences, and is through the text, through the pen. So, but then as that calling kind of started taking over me, basketball started getting smaller in my mind. And so over time, during my junior year, halfway through the junior varsity season, my father and I, we sat down with the head coaches, and I told them I'm committing myself to ministry, and I'm leaving basketball. And so it was a very cool conversation we had. And so then I started leading Bible studies on campus at the school, and again, blogging and all that stuff. And then it was, again, senior year when I was actually doing these Bible studies on campus once a month or once a week. So it was September 18th, 2015, when I had my last presentation in preparation. I was doing a lot of these presentations for my senior project, which was Why I'm Not a Christian, in quotes, answering Christianity's toughest questions, the objections to the faith. And so I gave, my last presentation was entitled Epistemological Explanations, How You Can Know What You Know to Be True, because it's from an all-knowing God who's always true. And so I gave that presentation on September 18th at the lunch hour to all these, we had largest turnout we had with both lunch hours around 40 or 50 kids. And then 6 hours later, I'm hit by the car. Life changed forever. So
I remember either watching live streams or I was at your youth pastor's house when you're like in the basement at lunch teaching a bunch of kids the Bible. And it was like, this is this is not like, this doesn't usually happen. Like maybe a youth pastor's doing it. Maybe, that was kind of the moment I think I'm watching you kind of develop your faith in high school and like take things very seriously. Not that you hadn't been a Christian for a long time, but, and your family, but that was the moment where I was kind of like, yeah, Cameron's going to do like really cool things, And so that's relevant because there's a few questions I want to ask you later about how your faith relates to the accident and your faith before the accident, but it's relevant that God took a hold of your heart in a very serious way, shaping your desires, shaping like the trajectory of your life, before you got hit by a car.
Right.
Like before that thing completely turned your life upside down. Like that's so relevant to the story, right?
Very relevant, yeah.
Go on.
No, it's very relevant, Chris. I'm glad you brought it up because a huge point in the book is that the same problems I had before the accident did not go away. Like the same problems I had before the accident are the same problems I had after the accident. And the primary problem... but I don't know if I want to jump to this point.
Describe, first, before that, because this is super relevant too. Describe the extent of the accident. Describe how badly, you've done it probably 1,000 times at this point. But for the people who might be watching or listening who haven't heard your story, how bad was the accident? Because it wasn't just like, oh, I got hit by a car on my bike. Right.
Yeah. So I was on a skateboard, technically a longboard, just a longer skateboard, and hit by the car and shattered the windshield of the Lexus and dented the rooftop with my head and shattered my skull. The cover of the book has a
you can't
graphic
see it
of the skull.
If it's audio only, but I'm holding up the graphic of the cover, and what they say technically was like a third of your...
Yeah, so it's about a third of my skull. And it's funny because WLKY TV did a news story.
I saw it. They said you lost a third of your brain.
A Southern Indiana man loses one-third of his brain and goes on to become an attorney or something.
Like, that's amazing.
I'm like,
You're really something, Cam.
Clickbait. That's clickbait.
Yeah, no, that was crazy.
So I
saw that and I was like, wait.
For the viewers out there, I did not lose a third of my brain. I lost a third of my skull. Which is interesting because that gets into the nature of the injury, because it could be worse to say that I damaged a third of my skull than losing a third of my brain, because in having that impact on my skull, you have what's called a diffuse axonal brain injury. So we've heard of a diffuser. It fills the air with a scent. So a diffuse injury fills the brain with damage. So the damage can just spread throughout the brain. And the brain's so complicated that you don't know what's really going to be affected and what's going to be injured. And
so it's like a ripple that you don't know where it stops.
Yeah.
Like that kind of thing.
Right. So it can just cause a lot more damage than just slicing off a third of your skull or a third of your brain. Yeah. So with a severe diffuse axonal brain injury, it's damage throughout a majority of the brain. And having this injury can lead to all sorts of permanent problems and lifetime repercussions. And there was actually pieces of my skull in the police photos that were on the car, and there were bloody glass shards with tufts of hair on them that actually landed on the people that hit me. And so there's the trauma I faced, obviously, but there's the trauma the driver faced. A lot of people don't think about this because I mentioned that I left the hospital early. Now, when I did get home, I was still planning to get married to my fiance, and we got our wedding invitations, and I went to the driver's house and gave them an invitation to my wedding. And they shared with me the stories and traumas that they've been going through, and that they that they hadn't been sleeping very well ever since, and they're just having lots of nightmares about it because I mean I shattered the windshield and just bloody glass shards adorned their body. It was just very traumatic for them, and so they actually did come to the wedding. And so I think me going to their house and handing them the invitation kind of gave them a closure that I don't think they expected, and I'm thankful to have been able to do that for them. And
I mean, part of that accident, you mentioned in the book that your shoe, somebody found your shoe
like
like
it was like
60
2 or
feet
3
in
weeks
a
later, someone
tree.
found one of my shoes like 60 feet up in one of my neighbor's tree. So it like
I just want to like see how that happened. Yeah.
I mean, the whole thing happened just like 2 driveways from my parents' house. I was in high school, so living with your parents isn't weird.
Yeah.
So it was so close to home. That's what made it so bizarre for people and for my family. And that's a huge point because I don't remember anything about the accident. I don't remember that day. I barely remember I don't remember anything leading up to it. I don't remember it in my brain. There's no part of it that I remember. And that's a fortunate aspect of it for me, but it's obviously still a huge trauma for other people that were alive or that were conscious and that were experiencing what I went through, namely my wife, my fiance at the time, and then my parents and friends and immediate family and everybody else that was concerned.
And you said there was a younger girl that was out on the driveway too, just playing with you, right? And she fortunately did not see the accident, right? She heard it, but she didn't see what happened.
Yeah, 8-year-old Hannah, very sweet girl.
Which could just wreck you, right? Seeing that happen.
She didn't see it, which was great, but she heard it, and so she thought I'd been shot. And I talked to some other neighbors when I got home from the hospital, kind of interviewing people about it. And they said the same thing. They said it sounded like I'd been shot. They heard it, they were in their living room or something.
Man.
And so, Hannah thought I'd been shot, so she ran into her grandparents' house, like, Cameron's been shot. And so they called the police in Columbus, Indiana. It's a big deal. So everybody shows up.
Yeah.
And in the Lord's providence, I got care pretty quick. There's actually a nurse walking her dog nearby as well. She was able to help me right away as well. So, but yeah, because blood was pouring out of my skull, and so they had to.
So you got lifeline to the hospital in Indianapolis. I saw you there a few times, and I think there was at least a couple, and then I think I had visited you when you were in the rehab center too. And the reason I remember the rehab center, is because, and I'll never forget it, it actually had nothing to do with you initially. When we were waiting, because there were a lot of people that would come to see you in different times, and so we were kind of waiting on people to kind of cycle in and out of the rooms and things. And I think you were doing physical therapy at the moment. But we had to wait a little bit, and I overheard an older couple that was talking about church, and they were talking to their pastor who was visiting them. I think one of them was in that physical therapy place, and they said, they were talking about how young people don't donate any money to churches, and why do we need to accommodate people who don't add any value to a thing. And they were basically saying, then they were talking about music. They were talking about, well, why are we trying to play all these things that aren't hymns and all this stuff for people who don't even give any money to the church and that kind of thing, who like are hardly stakeholders. And it was an impactful conversation to like overhear people saying, because they would never say that to my face. They were, kind of talking about my demographic, and it was just like a sad thing. So that day sort of burned into my memory, because it gave me a look into like, oh yeah, like it's actually okay to try to help people or to accommodate people who don't like bring you any benefit.
Right.
Like that's the gospel. Grace. That's grace. That's Jesus. That's the that's the kingdom of God, favor. Man. Right. And it was just interesting, man. So I'll never forget that. But that did remind me of the physical therapy place, and the first time I got to really talk to you when you were healing up a lot. But in the hospital, you don't have the perspective that everybody else has,
right?
Which was like, man, watching your parents like live at the hospital watching other people step in to try to help you guys with other stuff, watching just all the students and friends and family and everybody that would come to pray for you and all these things that, you were totally unaware of. I remember visiting you once, and I don't think you remembered my name, which I wasn't offended by because you didn't remember Chelsea's name either. So it was like, all right, who am I, right?
I think you had hair that time, too.
I did have hair at that time. Yeah, I know. Nowadays, I walk past people on the sidewalk, and I'll wave at them and say hi. And they're like, who is that guy? Like,
No.
I'll even say, oh, how are you today? And I'll name their names.
Right.
And they're like, okay.
Smile and wave.
Never mind. So I just don't wave at people anymore. I don't say hi to people. But yeah, man, it was a wild time, and just such a freak accident that you wouldn't wish on anybody in the world, right? Obviously, but there were so many grace-filled moments in that. I mean, I remember there were people that would show up to the hospital who would encourage your parents in ways I don't even think they were ready for. I remember specifically your mom talking about one of your friends that showed up who I don't even think you were super close to, and I forget his name, and I kind of know who he is. I won't call him out, but your mom was so impressed by like his prayers for you, like his prayer life, and she was like, I just couldn't believe like how this high school kid prayed. It was just incredible. And a lot of stories like that, and a lot of needs that were met, probably by a lot of different people for your family. I just can't imagine being your parents and watching you sit. So you were in a coma for how long?
About 2.5 weeks.
2.5 weeks.
Yep.
Like, that's just crazy.
Well, yeah, I mean, post-coma life was also blurry.
Yeah.
So this is another aspect that's very romantic. And because Chelsea and I, like I said, we kind of had to fall in love again. And she just has always loved me and so faithfully and so well. And I proposed to her, and we got married the day we planned to get married, March 26, 2016.
So you were 18 when you got married?
So I was 18, so
Okay.
a few months after turning 18.
Right.
And so I barely remember any of that time. I barely remember the process of, preparing for the wedding. Barely remember after the wedding. So we had to fall in love again, in a way that was just, it was unilateral. Like, it was me. I had to learn how to step into this role, how to love her well, and I knew I wanted to. I knew I was meant to, and I committed my life to her, and I was conscious of that. But there was this relational, emotional element that had to be built again. And that's, people talk about the pain my family and other people had to go through, but she had to go through, her heart has just always been for me, and she had to go through so much. And just because she was the fiance, she wasn't really treated as she should have been treated by other people. And so that made things a lot more traumatic for everybody.
And it's hard to think of somebody that young as being a fiance.
Right.
Like,
exactly.
really, it
That's
truly
what I'm saying.
is.
So
like,
there was this gap in respect and dignity that
people didn't
people
understand.
just didn't
that
understand.
you had.
But like, that time was so traumatic for her.
Oh yeah.
And we've had many arguments about that time. Because to me, it's like, what's the big deal? But there were like 30 days of my, almost adult, almost 18. I was almost 18 years old when it happened. Like 30 some days of my adult life that I just don't remember a thing about.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And so in all of the drama that was happening at that time, and so she tries to help me understand that time better, but I'll never fully know. But I do understand how much she loves me. So
Right.
I believe that it was probably really hard.
Yeah. No, it was Chelsea's a baller too. I remember seeing her at random Bible studies, like Wednesday night Bible studies, that kind of stuff at Hartsville, First Baptist Church, Hartsville, where she grew up.
It's funny because she knows everybody. She knows like Aaron Lance. She knows Chris Scott. Like, she knows all these people, and we never knew each other.
Yeah,
It's
I
weird.
know. No, I remember thinking back in the day, like, man, whoever lands Chelsea, like, she's a catch, because she cares about the Lord, and she was faithful to like commitments and things like that. And so, I mean, I didn't know her super well.
Yeah.
I knew her parents a little better, and Levi, her brother,
Yeah.
and just have always really loved them. And they make my day when I get to see them. And so, yeah, great parents, great family. It had, you describe in the book how awkward it was, the whole walk to get engaged with Chelsea.
Oh, yeah.
And there are really.
I wasn't trying to say it was awkward.
No,
but
it's awkward because it's like
I dramatized it, but yes.
But it feels dramatic. Like
well, that's what I
anytime
mean,
you propose
yeah.
to somebody,
Right.
but I would say the conversation with parents is even harder because
You're right.
When I asked Bria's parents to marry her, I was more convinced she would say yes than I was that they would say yes.
Yeah.
And I think it was more
It's
of a
a
timing
scary
thing.
thing,
I
yeah.
didn't think it was like a me thing. It's just kind of like, well, who's going to make money? It's like, not me, but they still said yes. But I was out of college.
Yeah.
So I can't imagine how, nervous you'd kind of be to like, well, I can't really answer all those questions, right?
Yeah.
Getting engaged so young. So, now mad props to her parents. Like, they're troopers. Like, Chelsea, she has to be an amazing woman. One, to still be with you. Two,
For a lot of more reasons.
for a lot
than
of
one.
reasons. Regardless of the accident. But somebody who is always into something new. So something that you guys also, and you alluded to some of the things, but, after the injury, I mean, just so you know, we're painting a picture of how strong Chelsea is right now, right? Maybe she'll appreciate this. But after the injury, long recovery process, getting married, relearning somebody, relearning to love somebody all over again with a new personality, which is something you allude to in the book a lot, that it didn't just change like your outlook on different things in life or your physical makeup, right? But your personality had changed a lot. You go from super happy-go-lucky to somebody who's, having a lot of darker thoughts and darker days and harder days that you obviously didn't see coming. One of the things you mentioned is the idea of like survivor's guilt. Mm-hmm. And I think coming out of that to a beautiful wife, like, has to also probably add, like, it's not only that you survived, but that you were able to eventually kind of get back on that path of healing, like physically and emotionally and mentally and all that. A lot of that's still going on. But just to have somebody else there to do it with had to be huge. And there's really two people you give like crazy respect to in the book that really kept you going, and it was God and Chelsea. Right. And there's other people you mentioned, obviously, but they were like the two biggest ones. I mean, you reiterated over and over, like, you don't know what you could do without God or with Chelsea. Right. So yeah, man, how did she kind of work through some of that stuff?
Well, it's a tremendous question because
should just have her here, right?
She wouldn't want to do this though. She doesn't like this sort of stuff. But she instrumental to my recovery, instrumental to my life from day one. Now, as the book is written the way it is, I'm very kind of philosophical the way I think about things. So the reason I credit Chelsea for so much because I really don't see how I could do anything without her in my life, especially since the accident. But there is something to be said about embracing the calling of marriage. Okay, so in the book, I call marriage a subjective call. It's a subjective call because it's a union of who's, not a union of what's. So it's two becoming one. You're saying yes to each other personally. It's not an objective commitment. It's a subjective commitment. It's a personal commitment. And so and Chris, you touched on this, I was drawn to these things like marriage, the institution of marriage, the call of holiness, and the things in the Bible that God has laid out in the scriptures. I was drawn to that before the accident. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I had a desire to get married and to become a marriable man, to become a mature, grown, Christ-like, godly young man before I met Chelsea. So, like I said, she knew who all these Hauser people were, but I know you guys decently because of Bryce,
yeah.
But I had no idea who she was. But then I started really pursuing and developing a heart for the Lord and a heart for the things of the Lord, which marriage was a thing I believe the Lord wanted me to pursue. And so in doing that, over time, next thing you know, I see her. And she's the first girl I ever dated, last girl, hopefully I ever have a relationship with, because I married her. And the math was pretty simple. It was like, she believes these things.
Yeah.
And I'm attracted to her. We can spend the rest of our lives together. It really was that simple. And I am a very, I can't even say that. I can't say I'm a simple person, but because you look at this book and it's like, it's not exactly.
You're a complex person.
Yeah, but I feel it felt like it was that simple. You could almost call it love at first sight, but it was love with knowledge. Like, it was love based on knowledge, and knowledge of what she's committed to and what I'm committed to. And most importantly, we were committed to each other. And she, again, modeled that before the vows were even, set forth. So there was this issue for me with survivor's guilt, where my physical recovery progressed so rapidly. I looked at other people with traumatic brain injuries I started getting to know because I entered into that community, and started feeling bad that I looked so much better. And that's something I talk about in the book. But what is important is to notice, I guess, the objective practical differences with my outcome. And I credit, again, that proposal to Chelsea, because what marriage does is I call it a subjective calling. It's the only subjective commitment humans have, because it's not a commitment based on anything objective. There's no, in legal terms, there's no consideration for marriage, at least in the biblical view. You are saying yes to each other, yes to souls, to becoming one. So it's a subjective, personal commitment. And so me doing that as a 17-year-old and understanding what I was doing, again, I wanted to get married before I met her. That's very important, because people think, oh, you were just young and dumb, and it's like, no, I calculated the prospect of getting married to someone. And I weighed, I wanted to do this. This was something I wanted to do. And I didn't want to do it. It wasn't I saw her and then I wanted to get married. No, I wanted to get married, then I saw her.
Do you think wanting to get married, then seeing her, like seeing the person, do you think that, I think the critique could be, well, you could have said yes to anybody who fit that criteria, right? Like, that's probably like the pushback, is like, if you were already eager to get married, that was your goal, then like obviously it would make it easier maybe to find that person, versus finding that person then eventually developing like, I think I can marry.
Yeah, and I don't, when I say, it's not that I wanted to get married. It wasn't like, I really need to get married.
You mean eventually?
I just meant,
to the idea
I
of marriage.
wanted to become the kind of man that could, a marriable man.
Yeah, right.
Like, I wanted to embrace this character that the scriptures painted of the husband, head of the home, and sacrificing for his wife as Christ does the church, and like loving her and all those things. So, but to secularize this, what I'm saying is marriage calls you outside of yourself. And it doesn't just call you to a thing, it calls you to another being, another person. It's the subjective commitment. And that's what was so important about it, is because, I woke up from the coma. I had to relearn all these things. I had to relearn my fiance's name. And it's like, okay, Cameron, your dad's walking you up the stage and you're about to get married to this girl. And you know what this calling's about. And you've got to do it. And so it was like sink or swim for me. It was sink or swim. Cameron, you're going to prove to Chelsea you can do this. You're going to prove to Chelsea that you can lead her, that you can, make a life for her. You can do these things. And I was already that way before when I met her, because she's 2 years older than me. So I was already working, up. I was already working uphill and trying to get to her level. But then the accident took me down even further. And so now I had to to show her that I could lead her. I could, make money for her, put food on the table, and that I could just prove to her that I could do this.
Yep.
And she believed in me when arguably nobody else really had any reason to believe in me while I was in a coma.
Yep.
And her father actually was the one who mentioned, we understand if you don't want to be with Cameron anymore, but he said, but I want you to know Cameron's still in there while I was in the coma.
Yeah.
So she, that's when she said, I'll push him in a wheelchair for the rest of my life. So, but I hope I'm making that clear, because a lot of times when a teenager has a traumatic brain injury, what happens, more common than not, is the child goes home to the parents. And the parents do what all loving parents do, is they crank down on the child, and everything's great. There's no push. There's no push to get better. It's like, okay, honey, you're doing a good job. No, it's fine. They might be acting a fool in public. They might be speaking out, which are all normal things. Impulsivity is like a huge sign of a traumatic brain injury. And I still have issues with that, which is actually part of the reason I've been able to do a lot of the things I've done so quickly, because I'm just impulsive. I'm like, I have to write this book. Like, I have to, I'll stay up all night and write it, because I get really fixated on the desires that might come upon me, which can be really good or it can be bad.
Right.
But what I'm saying is, for me, it was I went home, but then a few months later I get married and I move away from home, go to a new city, Louisville, Kentucky, get an apartment by myself, which is kind of crazy that I did all that after just having this accident. Mm-hmm. And Chelsea and I get married, we move on campus, and now this new calling, it's calling Cameron. Cameron, you need to be this. Mm-hmm. Not just do that, but become this husband, become this, man. It's time to grow up. Like, again, sink or swim. Whereas if I wasn't engaged to her, I'd just be at my house with my parents, and this has nothing to do with them. This is just natural for all parents, where it's like you just want to coddle the child. And even if they don't coddle the child, there's still the issue of the push or the pull outside of this situation. I was pulled outside of the situation by the calling of marriage. That's a simple way to put it. I was pulled outside of my TBI in practicum by the calling of marriage.
So if you weren't married, you think it would have just been a longer road to recovery, if ever recovering the way that you did?
Yeah. I would not. Yeah, my life would look very different.
That gives so much more meaning to, like, a partner, right?
Right.
Like a somebody who's specifically given to you by God to be a helper, right? Whether it's a husband or a wife,
right.
To be the companion. What do you think? Because we can talk about this stuff for so long. What do you think was the toughest part of healing from TBI? Because we keep saying TBI, he mentioned it, but just to reiterate, traumatic brain injury. Because every time you said that for a long time, I was like, what is TBI? So traumatic brain injury, like, there's the mental, the physical, the emotional, the spiritual, and the relational. There were things I thought of. Out of all of those things, what do you think was the hardest? I would imagine it wasn't the physical.
Right. And so
even though if you knew Cameron and you saw the physical, you would think like that had to be the hardest recovery in the world. Like, your head was physically caved in. Like, like that. I mean, it was, pretty wild seeing the weight that you lost in the hospital, all that stuff, learning to literally talk again, walk, everything, right? Remembering who people were, saying words, all that stuff. But even then, I would say that probably wasn't the hardest part.
Well, you are correct. And that's kind of the surprise of the book, is how it so much is about a different kind of injury. And it's an injury I believe we all share. And I call it the subjective injury. So I had an objective injury that, MRI, X-rays, CTs, all these things could show axonal damage, skull fractures, and lacerations on my shoulders, and all these physical ailments. But what my hardest concern was, because I thought about your question, and I wanted to say emotional was the hardest thing for me. But I think what encapsulates all of it and fitting in with the book is personal. This personal struggle I had where I wasn't able to do the things I used to be able to do. Couldn't hoop, couldn't play basketball like I used to be able to. I couldn't talk like I used to be able to. I was leading Bible studies. I loved talking on the radio and just very extroverted, enjoying people. But I couldn't do any of that. And I looked weird. I had to wear a helmet everywhere I went for 4 months because it was just skin and then brain.
Yeah.
And you could see it in my eyes. A lot of people with concussions, brain injuries, TBIs, you can just see it in their eyes. There's a glazed look. And I had that for at least a year or two after the accident.
Can I read something real quick?
Yep.
One of the questions I had sent you was, it was just it set the tone for the book, in my opinion, where you said, it was right before chapter 1, you said, I had to find myself again. It was page XVI. You said, this is your life. This is your forever life, Cameron. The way you feel today, depressed, dragged, undone, is the way you'll always feel. Those strange looks, they'll keep coming. Those close friends, they'll keep running. Those goals of yours, they'll need rewriting. When I read that, I was like, oh, like even now I kind of get chills thinking about that, like, because it's such a strong, like moving place to be in your mind, you know, and especially like to see where you've come now, like it's inspiring, but depressing at the same time. And not just because it happened to you, but because I think there are a lot of people that feel the same way and they haven't even gone through a traumatic brain injury. So I think it's just really relatable, you know?
Yeah, no, I'm glad. Yeah, that introduction, that you're speaking at the introductory chapter, that came together really well. I'm thankful that it did because it's important. I mean, it sets the whole stage for the book. And I like the next sentences after that. My reality had been thoroughly undressed. Naked I felt and ashamed I was, which if you're familiar with the biblical narrative, you'll understand those kind of implicit references there. And because what's interesting to get to the garden is that Adam and Eve had an identity given to them by God. Like it was just theirs. They already knew it. There was no question about it. But then this objective injury happens to me, and now I'm starting to question my identity. And I feel because I can't do the things I used to be able to do, I can't speak the way I used to be able to speak, all these used to be's. And so in having those issues, the ones you just read, I look weird, I sound weird. Now my reality feels undressed. But that's if all I am is my objective reality. The way things look, or the way I sound, or the way I present myself. And
things we all care about.
Right. And I'm not devaluing any of those things because obviously I put them in the book because they were valuable and they still mean something to me. And they affect people. Yeah. They're real. And so, there was a piece above that, the things I used to be able to do, the things I used to feel, how desperate the loss felt as if it was really real, referring to the loss of my felt identity. Yeah. And there is a good amount. There's a decent amount of poetry in the book. Yep. And there's fiction, there's nonfiction, there's autobiography, personal memoir, cultural analysis, sociopaths are in there. There's just a lot going on in the book because the book is very human. And that's kind of the point. It's a subject. It's not an object. It is an object, and I make that clear in the book. But it's
the writing.
But it's a human. I'm presenting myself here. I'm showing you the great things about me. I'm showing you the awful things about you. I'm showing you the great things about other people. I'm showing you some awful things about other people. And it's a very human book, which makes it very approachable. But with these concerns I had about how I looked, how I sounded, all those things, it was really hard. But what made it harder for me, and this gets at the emotional side, is that there was a darker kind of force that was overtaking me that really didn't care about other people for good or for bad. Where like I love my wife, but I want to kill myself. I have kids now, but I still want to kill myself. I'm a lawyer now, but I still want to kill myself. I've got a nice house. I've got a dog. I got a white picket fence or something.
Yeah.
I had all those things except for the white picket fence. Because the external environment did not change the internal environment. And that's so key in all of this for me and how I got better. Because people want to know how I got better and how I got better the way I did. And I say it was by elevating my subjective problems over my objective ones. The objective ones are a problem, 100%. But the objective problems change the weight they have on your life when you have a different subjective change or a subjective perspective.
Yep.
Because, like, even if Job, of course, is a great example of this. Someone who had everything, and then he loses everything, and he's still saying, praise God. Praise God. It's like, okay, so if I have all these ducks in a row, if I do all the right medications and right exercises and get the right girl, get the right amount of kids, get the right degree, get the right job, all that, if I check all those boxes, will I be happy? Maybe. And I say maybe because some people do that and they are happy.
Yeah.
For a time, maybe forever. But what about you? It doesn't matter about other people. Like, how do you get happy? And how do you get happy with having a brain injury? How do you get happy with losing your abilities? Like, what if we focused on a different injury? And it wasn't the external one, it was the internal one. And I mean, again, like, this book gets into secular circles, it gets into Christian, theological, religious circles, because even if you don't want to embrace the divine, theological, metaphysical aspect of it, which is very in the book, there is just the whole talk about positive thinking. It's like, just be positive. But of course, you don't have a basis to be positive without the hope of the gospel. But, and you mentioned the apologetic side of it, because an apologetic it has nothing to do with an apology. It has everything to do with the historic sense of defending the faith. So a Christian apologetic, because this book is about finding the human subject in a world full of objects. So I use that, and I don't use that to scare people. That's why the first chapter of the book is very philosophical. And I originally put it in the appendix of the book because I didn't want to scare readers away.
Yeah, I mean, there's some sentences I had to read like 4 or 5 times.
Right. Oh, yeah. Well,
I'm not too bright, so.
No, you're great.
When a lawyer writes a book, I'm like,
well, excuse me. That's what Brian Blair at the Republic, we talked over the weekend about it. He was one of the test readers as well.
Oh, nice.
And he said people are going to be blown away that you can write, because a lot of lawyers are good writers, but a lot of them are technical writers. There's no, it's all objective.
Yeah.
Here's the facts. There's no stylistic prose or things like that. So not for every case, but that's just what he said. And so, and that's why
not a lot of storytelling, not a lot of
storytelling,
creativity,
or
right. Flow,
right? The poetry and stuff like that, or even the theology. We don't get into the abstract that much.
And it's no offense to lawyers.
Right.
It's just, like, my sister's a lawyer, but it's like she's not trying to write a book. And she's not trying to tell a story, and she's not trying to connect that story to the bigger, grander story, going on around us, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Although, trial lawyers are storytellers, for a jury and stuff, but it is different with this. I'm just saying what Brian said. This is what he said. He was just surprised that the book came out the way it did.
Yeah, go after Brian. Don't go after me.
No, right. He's wonderful. But so, subject, object, finding the human subject in a world full of objects. The reason that's important is because when I had the brain injury, it's like, okay, Cameron, you have this injury that most people say is the most personal injury you can have. because the brain is the physical conduit through which we have spiritual consciousness, you could say.
Yeah.
Like by the brain is affected everything. And so to damage the brain means kind of to damage everything else. And so it feels very personal because you can't do the things you're supposed to do and all those things. But the hope for me was in my faith that I'm more than a brain.
Mm-hmm.
But the brain injury told me I was not more than a brain because of how much it sucked and how hard it was and how hard it still is at times. Because it sure does feel like I'm all a brain because I can't do the things you're supposed to do. People look at me weird. I can't pronounce words correctly. I stutter or whatever it was difficult. And so if I wanted to have hope and encouragement beyond the injury, I had to find something beyond the injury. But I needed to find more than something. I needed to find someone.
Yeah.
And so this connects Chelsea. I found someone. But then ultimately it connects God to the whole thing because I found not just a mysterious force, but a personal God. A subjective power near and dear and available to all. As Paul says, in him we live and move and have our being. Yeah. So it's hugely important for me to have found something I could be regardless of life's happenings. And what is that? It's God's.
Yeah.
And that sounds so abstract and stuff, but that's why I really try to emphasize how much it's about like the changing the perspective. Because I started a nonprofit organization in 2017 called Voice of TBI, Voice of Traumatic Brain Injury. The original slogan was improvement over injury. Improvement over injury. So it was like trying to bring people healthy meals, try to talk about exercise and things you can do to like objectively get better. That was my goal. But I wasn't an expert. I didn't know. I was still in college. I didn't have any expertise on anything except my experience with the brain injury and the recovery.
Well, it's not a bad slogan in the sense that you also even in the book you mentioned taking what you have and not instead of like what don't I have, but what do I have and moving forward. So it's not like out of place.
Right.
I
put that in a footnote too.
It's not like inappropriate. It's not. Yeah.
No. And so when I refer to the original slogan, I'm really just referring to the approach at that time was like, let me do some research and I'll find ways to help people recover. And it was great. And it brought people together.
And that kind of changed then.
But then over time, it changed to rethinking traumatic brain injury, which is when I moved from trying to give people something I couldn't give them, which was an expertise for a particular issue. Maybe it's headaches, maybe it's, diet, maybe it's this. When there are plenty of experts out there who can do that. It's like, what can Cameron do for other people? Well, I can give you myself. And I want to help reach people. I wanted to tug at souls. And so eventually what kind of happened is the Voice of TBI meetings turned more for the caregivers than for the survivors. Because the caregivers, those taking care of the people with the traumatic brain injuries, are the ones who need the most care. They're having to go through their own stuff and nobody's worrying about them. And reaching their heart, reaching their soul was what I ended up really getting at. And obviously the overlap with the survivors came naturally because as I got better, it inspired other people to get better. Yeah. And helping other people get better helped me get better. I've always been really driven by other people and supporting other people really helps support myself. Yeah.
No, that's so good. And just so people know too, I mean, even past the injury stuff, I mean, it would be impressive for you to sit here and talk the way you do, look the way you do, move the way you do, think the way you do, all that. But then there's this whole other set of like incredible things that you've sort of been through too, that I do want to touch on because I don't want it to be lost, like all the things that you've kind of accomplished that, because if you're talking about helping people, inspiring people to continue to recover, that kind of thing. And like, hey, try to live the most normal life you can, if you want to call it that. So then after the injury, I mean, you're married, you you kind of made a change from ministry, right? And you ended up going into law. So that was kind of the first thing, right? You went into law school. That's hard without a brain injury. My sister experienced that. So it was terrible, that kind of thing. My wife went through dental school, same kind of thing, huge exams to study for, life-altering things that you're just study all the time to pass the thing, to be the person, to get the career, right? A lot of money, a lot of time just to buy into, like you're giving years of your life just and a ton of cash just to buy into a profession, right? But with the goal of helping people. So if that was something you always wanted to do, it's interesting. And it's cool that seemed to be a consistent part of your character, right? You wanted to do that before the accident, then even moving forward, that's something you got into. So you moved into a specific kind of law that you do?
Yeah, so I'm a personal injury attorney in Indiana and Kentucky with the same attorney who worked my case 8 years ago. So it's pretty special.
And you had mentioned him as being very special in the book.
Oh, yeah.
So I would give him...
He wrote the foreword.
I was going to give him a third kind of an honorable mention. So earlier there was like God, Chelsea,
and then
Matt Shad.
Yep.
Who I'd love to meet. Sounds like a great guy.
He's a wonderful
but it sounded like, and you specifically had, I don't know if I jotted it down, but there was a specific mention of the fact, page 118, that Matt Shad, and this is relevant. It was all good until you put the line, he believed in me. And that seems so simple, but it's also so powerful, because before that you had mentioned it's not about what you do or where you have been. It's about who leads you through. I met Matt less than a year after my brain injury, so the timing is like huge on that. So like he's still seeing a lot of the beat up Cameron at that point, right?
There's nothing objectively impressive.
So I met Matt after my last year of my brain injury. I had just received a high school diploma, gotten married, and incurred a severe head injury. My speech was slurred, mind raced, and temperament displaced. There was nothing objectively impressive about me. And then it goes on to say, but Matt was subjectively drawn to me. He believed in me. Right. And that's got to be like huge for somebody in your position who probably, I would say, a lot of people at that point would lose hope in a specific version of you, right? Something that they thought you'd aspire to, something you maybe even wanted to, like, oh, Cameron wanted to be a writer. Well, there goes that, well, Cameron wanted to be a basketball player. Like, there certainly goes that, that kind of stuff. Like, you're probably immediately written off in a lot of ways. So I think for somebody like Matt to come along with his own law firm and say, like, you kind of see something in somebody is just huge.
Right. Oh, tremendous.
So can you just describe that relationship real quick? Because even to write the foreword of the book, I mean, he had to be a huge influence in your life, right? And that the law turn that you took.
Yeah. Matt Shad has been a tremendous mentor to me and father figure to me after the accident. And it's true to put it that way, that he believed in me when I didn't even believe in myself, and I didn't know what was going on. This was still less than a year after the injury, so even less than a year after I woke up from the coma. And he was just so drawn to us, me and Chelsea. And that's powerful. It's powerful to have someone who really cares about you. And it's important why they care about you. It's not because you look super good, not because you act super well, not because they get something out of it, but because they do. They chose you, just like the whole gospel of faith idea that the Lord chooses to love us even though we don't deserve it.
Yeah, and without anything to offer him.
Without anything to... There's no benefit. Matt Shad, at least at the time, there was no objective benefit he was going to get out of befriending me.
Yeah.
An 18-year-old
he couldn't have seen the progress.
Seminary student.
Yeah, he couldn't have seen the progress that would have happened physically, mentally, any of that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. And this is something I haven't really thought about until this instant right now, because I do talk about a concept I developed a few years ago called the post-mortem effect. Post-mortem effect. And in short, it means we don't see people until they're gone.
Mm-hmm.
And Matt saw me subjectively. That's the way I'm using the word. He saw me, and he loved me. He cared about me when there was nothing objectively impressive. And so I bring up the postmortem effect because we have these characteristics and reasons why we relate to people based on mostly objective things, like, oh, they've got high social status, they've got money, they look good, I want to talk to them. These kind of reasons why we relate to one another. But when that person passes away, we don't care about that stuff anymore. Now there's these other characteristics that stand out to us in our mind. They're like, oh, he was loving, he was kind, he was sacrificial, he was faithful, he was on time. Like these characteristics that David Brooks calls your eulogy virtues, the stuff people talk about when you're dead, versus the resume virtues, which again is from Brooks, the stuff you talk about while people are alive and trying to apply for a job.
Which are typically what we chase.
This is what I'm saying.
The resume, yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
But it's crazy how much our culture and how much we ourselves push ourselves towards things that nobody gives anything about.
Yeah.
When you're gone.
Right.
It's like, what if we could see people now instead of seeing them when they're gone? Why can't we see somebody while they're alive? Why do we have to wait till they're in a casket to really see them?
Right.
And that's where Jesus gives the perfect example of the postmortem effect, because while he was on the cross, he was put on the cross because of the objective, claims that he was the Messiah. I mean, like he was the Messiah and all these things, but they were trying to kill him because of those reasons.
Yep.
But then once he yields up his spirit, the people standing there and notice the ground shakes, the storms, all this stuff, curtains torn, and then the bystanders, they say, truly, this was the Son of God. It's like once he was gone, then they saw him, but he was gone. So the question is, do you see him before you're gone? And but not just Jesus, but each other. Mm-hmm. Like, can I really see you, Chris Scott? Can you really see me? And like, am I seeing you just for what I get out of you, or am I seeing you for who you really are, in the eyes of God, in the eyes of the Scriptures?
And sometimes you don't really know. You don't really know who. You don't know what you're looking for in a person. You only know what they tell you. You only know what they show you. Right, which is why people say social media sucks, because you're just putting forward the best version of yourself. That's, social media is like your social resume, sort of. What are the best things about you? The best pictures, the best. How do I make my family look the best, and my kids the cutest, and my job, me the most successful, that kind of thing.
It's purely objective, and it's
I mean,
not spiritual.
When Bria saw you on our doorbell camera, I told you when you walked in, she texted me. She was at work and she said, "You need to wear a suit." She said, "You need to put a suit on." If Cameron's there in a suit, I was like, I'll be me.
I wear
I'll
this
let
like
him
6
be
days
him,
a week.
and I'll just be a scrub. And it's
No.
But the book really is like super Bible saturated. A lot of scriptural text. Actually, so Sunday morning, I was pretty sick this past weekend. I didn't go to church, and I'm sitting at the table reading my Bible, and it was at the very end of the book of Matthew. And he's talking about the same passage that you actually that I opened up to, like, immediately after. That's just the point in the book I was at. I'm not a, there's been times in my life where I was like, go Bible, like, show me God. What do you want me to read? What's important right now, But I don't really do that anymore. But it was the last place I was reading. And it was just a really interesting thing that they were talking about the resurrection and the, just a cool thing that there was so much scripture in the Bible. I won't talk about specifically why that was weird for me, seeing those two passages in the same 10 minutes. It was kind of odd. But something that people don't talk about a whole lot, and I guess I just mention it when they talk about proving, or they basically devise the lie. Hey, we spread it amongst ourselves, the leaders and the officials, that this is the story. They craft a narrative that it was a conspiracy theory that Jesus' disciples showed up and removed him from the tomb. And then the author, Matthew, saying this happened to this day. This happened to this
Right,
day, the
right.
day of this writing, which was like 50 years later, from the time of Jesus to potentially him writing Matthew.
Right.
So it was just kind of a wild thing that you mentioned that, and there's so many other stories you mentioned in that. Did you ever comment on that?
Well, just the objective strand versus the subjective one. Like the people don't like bipolarities. They don't like this or that, black or white. Like, we just like to say things are so much more complicated. Everything's kind of gray. But a lot of things are pretty black and white. And when it comes to the resurrection, it was black and white. It was either he did rise from the dead or no, he didn't.
Thinking back through, like, we haven't even really touched on just the fact that you have at one point you had 4 kids under 2. You had triplets. You had, you were in law school. It was during COVID, so you had mentioned you guys had to stay home for a couple of years, like, for a long part of that time, which helped, but that's still just incredibly hard.
Just hard for both
incredibly
of us, yeah.
hard for both of you. COVID was hard for everybody, right? So regardless of that, then Chelsea's in med school. And I just can't fathom that either, going from your law school to her med school. But one of the things, through all of that stuff in the book, your focus still is so hardcore on the gospel. And page 155, you said, everything I have tried to explain in this book about finding yourself, finding someone to hold on to, and having a subjective identity that nothing can take from you goes out the window without the resurrected person, right? So we were kind of talking about, not sure where that stopped. We were just talking about the importance of the resurrection, how much that means in the world. And then you jump down several lines later and say, there's a reason the name of Jesus Christ has outlived every other name on earth. It's because the name came to us, lived among us, died for us, rose above us, and calls to us. And that's just so good because I love that the emphasis is still Jesus, still the resurrection. It's still a call to come investigate this faith, while, as you mentioned earlier, it's not written as like an apologetics book. Although there is some language on like, hey, if there's a subject or if there's an object, there has to be a subject, right? And there has to be a creator because of creation, that kind of thing. So I guess, how do you think people should navigate finding God's purpose? Because you mentioned him calling us. So not just salvifically, like not just being called to salvation and called to repentance, but God's calling on your life that you've probably had to navigate in some really hard ways, right? You've had to navigate like, okay, I'm skilled in different ways. Those skills have changed a little bit, but I would say you still have those skills. Like you could still probably give a great speech. You're still a personable person. You've had to regain a lot of that, those functions, right, in your life, in your mind. But how would you encourage, because I really want this to be encouraging for other people, even who haven't had a traumatic brain injury, how do you navigate the calling that God puts on your life? Like, what do you look for in that? How do you decide to go to law school? How do you decide you're going to have all these kids, or that, if you're Chelsea, man, life's really hard, but I'm going to go to med school? Like, because I feel like you guys actually view life as in God is like leading you in different directions, right? It's not like life is just like happening to you. So how do you do that while also not saying like it's all God or it's all me? Because in the book, a lot of times you allude to, and this is kind of a complicated question, but I'm mashing some together. You allude to this idea that God is the one. It's because of God that all these things are happening, can happen, all this. Yes, and it's his favor and it's his grace that you turned out how you turned out, and somebody else with TBI maybe won't ever do anything close to those types of things. How do you balance that with this idea that like you've worked really, really hard? So like if you can encourage somebody who's like, man, what do I do? It's like, how do you talk about it in your story without also making somebody else feel like, well, if God doesn't do this or these incredible things, then like, well, what am I going to do if it's all God? Does that make sense? Versus having to work really, really, really hard to accomplish things that you think God is calling you to do. Like, how do you hold those things in tension?
Yeah, it's a great, wonderful question, Chris.
It's a terrible question. It's just a good
No,
idea.
no,
It's a good idea. I didn't
it's
phrase it very well.
well, it's important because comparisons abound in the world where we're just constantly like, look at what, especially you mentioned social media.
Yeah.
You see someone else has this, you want that too, and this gets back to, you mentioned the people in the hallway, and I don't want to bring that up because I'm probably going to use that in one of my talks later on, although people are reading the book now.
Yeah.
But anyway,
It's all out there, man.
right,
And I haven't even got to the dark stuff.
right. I know, but it's like, what if the focus is more on being and becoming instead of doing and acting? Like I want to do that someday. I want to have that. Do that, have that, feel that. Like, what if it's about like becoming someone who, no matter what happens, they're still on top. They still have joy. They still have energy.
Yep.
There's still life in them.
Yep.
Regardless of what happens. And because one of my favorite scriptures is a scripture most people wouldn't think to be a favorite scripture, and it's 1 Corinthians 4:7. The Apostle Paul asks a very profound question. What do you have that you have not received? Mm-hmm. What do you have that you have not received? Love that question so much, because here's the thing. Here's the reality of the reality. The good stuff of life comes in the exact same way the bad stuff. The bad stuff comes in the exact same way the good stuff does.
Yep.
It's like, sure, I might have played some causal part in that. Maybe it was my fault, the longboard. Maybe I mentioned this. Maybe it was my fault. Maybe it was the driver's fault. It doesn't matter. The issue is it happened, Cameron. What are you going to do about it? That's the ultimate question. Life is about response. It's not about causality. Like, I caused this, you caused this. I need to get back at you. You're going to get back at me. It's about, how am I going to respond to what does happen? Am I going to respond in faith, and respond in righteousness, respond in goodness, in grace, in humility? Or am I just going to argue against this reality that I'm faced with? That's why one of my favorite, you didn't even mention one of the favorite things in here. My favorite thing is the interlude, an argument against argument. Because
that was a hard chapter, man.
It's hard.
That was a hard chapter.
Oh, but you gotta read it a couple times.
What page you on? Because I'm gonna
77.
Because it is possible that I. I didn't underline anything on that page, bro.
Oh, it's
nope.
It's yeah. There's a lot here. There's a lot.
What? So go for it.
But 77, second full paragraph. In a world created by divine speech, the most damning proposition is to question what was spoken. The first argument in history began with questioning ultimate authority, and not the authority of the being, but the authority of his sayings. The serpent intentionally phrased his argument, did God really say? The great limitation of all human argument, the objective world. The serpent questioned the divine object, the command, which led Adam to disobey the divine subject. Now here's the important part for application. Life is far more difficult when we willfully deny what is before our very eyes. To question what God has said does not just include the biblical scriptures, but also what God has spoken into one's life. The people around you, the body encompassing you, the resources supporting you, the home sheltering you, the trauma battling you, and the future awaiting you, all of this has just been received by you. You may have played a causal part in some of that, but regardless, this lot has come your way, and the more you argue against it, the slower you are to deal with it. Thus, argumentation often takes the form of distraction. So, 1 Corinthians 4:7, what do you have that I have not received? A general concept I've derived from that question is the idea of acceptance. Not in the sense of tolerance and that sort of
Right.
way, but like acceptance in a personal sense.
Yeah.
Like I'm accepting how I feel right now. I'm accepting what they said to me or how they're looking at me. And you either bring it to God in prayer or you just think about it. You deal with it. You don't just react. You respond. Remember, life is about response. So reacting is a very natural thing for someone with a traumatic brain injury. You got a feeling, you just want to act on it. But the calling here is to be somebody, to not be ruled by your feelings, the objective world around you or the world you're experiencing, but to rule over those things, to have dominion, to have self-control, a fruit of the Spirit. So So to answer your question that was very deep and convoluted is work with what you got and work with it well. And if you don't like what you got, keep working and learn to like it. Because like there are a lot of people, like studies and things out there about people in other countries and how they're a lot, like I say other countries, that's very vague, but like third world countries in particular, where there's just a lot more joy. There's a lot more happiness. And then these modern Western world that we live in, there's a lot of depression, a lot of Prozac, a lot of counseling and all this stuff. And yet we've got everything. And so that's just a very simple way to differentiate the two. But what if you enjoyed your lot, even if your lot wasn't a lot?
Yeah. Well, that's sort of, hope I don't cut off the idea, but that's sort of on page 163, and we don't have to read that one for the sake of time, but you mentioned like some people tend to develop their view of God and then interpret everything that happens through that lens. But then there's other people who seem to kind of meet God elsewhere. They meet him in the midst of trials. They meet him, the true him, like the most intimate form of God they feel like they meet in a trial. Right. So those two things are going to like drastically shape the way that you see your circumstances, right? So the person who has a relationship with God and knows the scriptures, like they have a lens that they're viewing something through, right? Because they have a certain type of knowledge of him. And then like, would you say that your relationship with God was somehow had prepared you for the life that you have now and like the stuff that you were going to have to go through? Or do you think you have met God in a different way through all of those things that you're able to like look back and interpret everything through? Like, which of those do you think it's been for you?
Yeah, well,
And I'm going to follow this with the dark stuff.
okay. I definitely think I was prepared for the accident. And again, kind of using the secular parallel here with one of my Voice of TBI meetings was about helping people do the things they need to do to prepare for a brain injury. So nobody knows when they could get hit by a car and suffer a concussion of some sort. But if you're healthy and you're taking care of yourself, you're kind of preparing yourself for whatever happens. So maximizing your outcome by being proactive rather than reactive. Now, in my case, I was filling myself with the God of the Bible and the scriptures and the things just with serious depth and thought into my life. And a lot of that was about suffering. A lot of that was about sanctification.
Yeah.
And so then I'm hit by the car, and now my world is shook. My brain is literally shook. And the canvas of my life, like an Etch-a-Sketch, is just shook clean. And the Lord starts sketching in a new vision for my life. And that's the huge point with the 1 Corinthians 4:7. What do I have that I have not received? I didn't choose my looks. I didn't choose my parents. I didn't choose where I was born. I didn't choose, like, just so much of life is not there. It's not democratic. And that's why when I write a poem, it's usually because I was able to reduce an idea I've been working on in my head for a long time into a short poem.
There's a lot of them.
Yeah, there's about 6 or 7. But the poem, The Objective Life, on page 28, The Objective Life. The world is objectively unfair. Some live in mansions, others house under park benches. Some run marathons, others muscle a wheelchair. Some write books, others can barely read. Most live to their 70s, some die in their 20s, and many die as babies. Someone else's vacation spot is another's nightmare. Woe to the objective life, how she's never been fair. Point is if your emphasis is on how the surface looks different, or it's bad, or it's better, and that's your sole focus, you're not going to be happy.
Right.
But if there's something out there that only you can have, it's subjective. Like, only I can have a relationship with God. I don't know if anybody else can.
Yeah.
I'm not you. But I know that calling is up to me. And that's why Jesus Christ is the only one that's a leader in history that says the way to follow him is not by doing anything objective. It's not by obeying his teachings. It's not by doing what he does. It's not by saying what he says.
Yeah.
It's all about you. Deny yourself. Pick up your cross and follow me. And all 3 of those things are unverifiable. I can't tell if Chris Scott's denying himself today. You can't tell if I am. But you know if you are. Only you would know. But then the other person that would know is God.
Yeah.
It's such a non-human thing to say. Because when I want my children, when I tell my kids what to do, like Frankie, put your plate away after dinner, and I walk over 10 minutes later, and she's out there playing in the yard, and her plate's still at the table, and she didn't put it away. Like, I can objectively verify that was disobedience. She did not obey me. Yeah. But when Jesus says, deny yourself, pick up your cross, follow me, it's like nobody can prove that or verify that obedience except for you, or except for God. Only how God could. Yeah. And so that's the subjective life. Like, it's this life where you are accountable to God, not to other people. Your primary accountability is under God, because in him is where you find yourself. Because if there isn't someone who always is, then there's nobody I can be.
Yeah. You mentioned self. I know you got to go. Cameron's got a lot to do. The biggest thing, and we'll kind of end here, and then I'll just mention a couple things about where people can find the book and everything. The biggest thing reading through the book for me was your inner dialogue. And it's because I know who you are, really well. I know who you feel like you used to be really well. And those are 2 seemingly different people, the way you describe yourself, not just your body change, you developed different food allergies, all kinds of stuff that has happened to you, ways that your mind doesn't work. One of the biggest things was the difference in the way that your attitude is and your inner conversation, the dialogue that you have with yourself. And I meant to touch on this first because it was such an impactful thing for me, but I think being a person who has a lot of inner dialogue that is like, woe is me, you suck, like, or this day is great, oh, this is wonderful, like everything around me like is perfect, my family's amazing, my wife is gorgeous, we have, like, we're fine financially, that kind of stuff. Yet you can still be saying you're a freaking loser, nobody loves you, nobody cares about you, it'd be better if you weren't here. Like, truthfully, like there's times I've had those thoughts. And so you talk a lot, like, very openly about that in the book. There was specifically page 19 and 20. I'm just going to read this really quick. because it was kind of the way you introduced the book. You said if others knew, on page 19, halfway down, if others really knew about the other me, you keep talking about another me, kind of like these two conflicting people
Right.
within
Jekyll
your
and
soul.
Hyde.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Jekyll and Hyde type of idea. If others really knew about the other me, they would be quick to befriend another. Like they wouldn't want to be your friend. And then you had mentioned further down, when I'm overtaken by the other me, I incur dementia and lose all remembrance of normal me. I drop my morals, I lose my values, I forget my family and friends, I care no longer about status or upholding reputation, and this is all fitting because, as you remember, when the other me is me, there never was any other me to begin with. And then you mentioned several other things. The other me hates normal me, you say, right? And how many times do we feel, and that's very Paul-esque, you mentioned that in the book,
Exactly,
like, why do I do, Paul mentions in the scriptures, why do I do the things I hate and not do the things that I know I should do? And then later you say, my desires of suicide are only a pursuit of disbarring myself from this wretched roommate.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like when Paul says, like, wretched man that I am, who can deliver me from this body of death? And, like, thanks be to God.
Right.
But these are conversations. This isn't like a year after. This is like conversations you're having with yourself, in your mind, in your heart, years after in recovery. Like, even in the last few years that and like, you're so open about that in the book. Do you ever worry about, like, when you're writing that, one, do you worry about what people think of you? But then two, I mean, did you even have any idea how many people probably have that inner dialogue? Is that kind of why you wrote it?
Well,
was it therapy for you to write it, or was it like, this is real for other people? This can help other people to know that they're not the only people having these internal conversations that other people can't see, can't hear, may never know about, right? Until something terrible happens.
Well, like I was saying a while ago in our conversation, that this book's very human.
Superhuman.
It's very human.
Yeah.
And so I've never tried to present myself as something I'm not. Mm-hmm. And you asked me in your outline, like, how I went about writing this. Did I have a target audience in mind? And publishers, I submitted this to a variety of publishers and got lots of different feedback. And a lot of other publishers were just kind of wanting to see how this does and go from there. But they would ask me target audience. Yeah. And I'm like, everybody? And they're like, oh, yeah, we hear that all the time. Like, oh, my book's for everybody. But I really feel, man, my test readers can attest to it. They just all say there's something in here for everyone. And that's why I have the preface, You Can Read This Book, which I did not call a preface because people don't read the preface. So I just called it You Can Read This Book. And I explained that you can read the book however you want. You can jump into chapter 3 without reading chapter 1. But it's all under the umbrella of identity and the ontological question of man. What is man? Which is the deeper philosophical layer beneath the whole thing. But you can read, different parts of the book will be more resonant for the reader, depending on what the issue is or what they're going through. And I wrote a blog. I stayed up all night writing a blog about 4 days ago called Saving the Subject is a Lasso to the World. And I felt like I had to write the book. Nobody put a gun to my head, but maybe I did to myself. I felt this unction to write the book, and which is why I was able to write it so quickly, because I had probably 12 all-nighters, 600 hours put into the book, probably at least. When we look at the objective world, we see things that we want, but we also see things that we don't really care about. There's a difference between what we see and what we want versus what we see and what we care about. And so I say what we care about is the subjective world. It's the personal world. It's the relational world. It's that world, the spiritual world. That's the world we care about. But most of the time we're fixated on the objective stuff. So when Cameron comes in here and presents himself honestly, sharing his journal entries, I know I'm speaking about myself in the third person, but there's kind of a reason I'm doing that. Because here he is presenting himself with full vulnerability and honesty to the readers, saying, here's how I desired to kill myself. here's all the stuff I was struggling with. Here's all my problems. And here's how I tried to work through them. Like, what I'm doing is I'm presenting me as best as I possibly can, because books inherently are objective things. They're just words on a page. But if I can somehow try to bring to life a subject like myself, that's what I tried to do. And so that's why I'm raw, and that's why I'm vulnerable, and that's why I'm honest, because I don't know how else to be.
Yeah.
And which is why the Voice of TBI group changed from this objective help to now I'm just subjectively. Now I'm trying to help them personally with the ways I know that have helped me and I believe can help them. And so, yeah, I'm surprised you didn't mention melancholy, I'm not chasing happiness. I'm not chasing a high. I'm just
Bro,
trying
you know how many things are in this book? I can't.
I know,
got like an hour and a half. I can't talk about all
I
these.
know. But
I even had a hard time figuring out where to stop. But yeah,
right.
go ahead.
No, it's true. Like, melancholy was one of the most powerful things I wrote, because it was literally the last day I had, January 30th, 2023, was the last day I had a serious bout with suicidal ideation and depression.
You did mention that, which is great to end on a high note. At least thus far, right?
Right. Yeah. And so I wrote this, and it's key the way I wrote it. So it wasn't me writing about my feelings. The one you mentioned, the other me,
Yeah.
prose, that was writing about my feelings, just about them, describing them.
Yeah.
January 30th, 2023, melancholy, under the title Pen to Pain. The difference is I took to writing at my feelings instead of writing about them. And what I wrote proved transformative. And so, this has a rhythmic flow to it where I'm like going up and down, up and down, up and down. Taper, but none the greater. Weep, the pain is deep. Break, the spirit aches. Something not attached to a purpose is nothing, but that something does not exist because everything has a purpose. The question is, do I have a purpose? Praise the Lord for the pain. Praise the Lord for the melancholy. Praise the Lord for the despair. Praise the Lord. We praise because he gave, and we praise because he also takes away. How does one handle it? You hold on and you wait it out. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. The scariest thing would be for God to give and not take anything away. Or in the reverse, to never give. Because this life is fallen and broken. It needs to be taken away. God gave it the earth. It fell. He took evil away at the cross, and he will make all things new. So the formula, he gives life, he takes away death, and he closes with eternity. In the end, we'll all see what mattered. But by then, it'll be too late. See it now, believe it today, and follow it forever. But the ups and downs are good because they are divine. I have never been a person that likes things staying the same way anyway. He's making me into a whole person. It's not that I need to move away and pray for better days. It's that I need to keep trusting him to hold and carry me to glory. Persevere because the end is near. And so this is my big word of advice to everybody who has struggles with depression, suicidal ideation, or they just don't like where they're at in life and they're frustrated in general. They don't necessarily have the emotional turmoil of these type of things I'm describing here. But this little poem is applicable to everyone. So hold on. Hold on to your kite of a life, where some days it'll fly high, others it will fly low. Some days it'll toss to and fro, others it will not. But regardless of what happens to your kite, the number one task is to keep a strong grip on that string. And maybe that's the right perspective, to hold on to life like a string to a kite, because that's all you can do. Trust him with the weather.
That's good.
It's like, here we are, born into this unchosen consciousness, this reality we've all received, and the question is, how are we going to respond to it? How are we going to deal with it? And the outcome is not in our hands. The outcome is divine, and it's always been that way every time. So trusting and having not just an idea to trust in, but a person to trust in, whether it's your spouse, your friend, ultimately the Lord who puts all these people in your path and holds you through the storm and holds you through the rosy days and like just the good, the bad, the ugly. Not just a great outcome, but a great being holding your life. Like that's hope.
That's such a good last word. Yeah, I appreciate that. Before I let him go, everybody, we're gonna call it quits. Had some technical issues, so we'll see what comes
We'll
out
see
of
what
this.
comes
We'll
out of
see
this.
what God wanted you guys to hear. But everybody can buy the book in a few different places, right? So Amazon is one. I'm gonna have a link to that in the description of the video on YouTube and the audio podcast. If you on Apple, Spotify, wherever. Viewpoint Bookstore, right? Local bookstore in Columbus, Indiana. Viewpoint Bookstore. Maybe you can outsell Brandon Andrus. He'll be like your local rivalry there. Yeah, because they're always running out of his book. So I hope the same thing happens to you. So Viewpoint Bookstore, and some of those are signed, right?
The ones they have right now are signed. Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
nice.
But ideally, people will go to.
Yes. So third thing, Cameron is having a book signing. Where's this thing? Ugh. Caught my shoe. Cameron is having a book signing at Columbus North High School. I don't know if anybody has seen this flyer. He's passed them around to several places, but alma mater. Get to go back 9 years later.
Exactly 9 years later.
Exactly
Almost
9 years
to the
later.
hour.
And share your story, share what God's done in your life, share about the book. And you can buy physical copies of the book, and you can also get them signed by Cameron. He might even put little hearts in it, little special notes that not everybody else gets, So, anything you want them to know about that event, if you want to meet Cameron in person, get a signed book, buy a book in person, just go to hear some of his stories, September 18th from 7 to 9:30 p.m. at Columbus North High School. Any word on that?
Well, yeah, so I'm doing several book tour events and before the end of the year, and this one on the 18th is going to be the most special because it's the 9-year anniversary. I'm going back to my old high school. I was in high school when it happened, and the dean of the school, Paul Ferguson, he's also the head boys basketball coach. He came on during my senior year, and he's a believer, and so we'd go out to lunch every other month or so, and we just got to know each other. And so when the accident happened, he was right there and praying for everybody. And so he's actually going to kind of moderate and lead the event.
Nice.
He's going to share a message, and then we'll do a Q&A and book reading and that sort of stuff as well. And so it'll just be really special. Bridge FM is sponsoring it. They're running an ad for it. And the Republic newspaper is covering the event as well. So it's a very community event. And we've got around 200 people so far that are committed to going. Nice. And so it's, that auditorium seats over 1,000 people.
Yeah.
So the more, the merrier. Just because I said if there's only like 50 people there, it'll feel like a poor turnout because it's so big. But
yeah, it's huge.
I'm excited because people seem to be excited about it, and I'm thankful to be able to share.
Yeah. Well, man, Cameron, I told you this privately a couple times, but when we had lunch recently, I'm so proud of you, not just because of everything you've accomplished, but because of the way that you've accomplished it, the perspective you've had, just getting to see you grow up and then be successful. There are just not many more joyful things in life than seeing your friends succeed at anything, at whatever they're trying to do, whether it's opening a restaurant, becoming a lawyer, becoming a doctor, just raise a beautiful family. Like it brings me so much joy to see people succeed in ways that don't benefit me necessarily, right? I mean, you're on my podcast, but your success doesn't do anything for me. But it's still such a pure joy to get to see you live out what God's called you to do, and in a way that's honoring to Him and honoring to your family. And so I just appreciate you so much. Thank you for making the time. And I would love for everybody to go pick up copies of the book, Saving the Subject. And I can't wait to see what happens with that, what happens with you as you continue to just grow your career, grow your family, grow your faith. And man, God's doing crazy things through you. So just don't let that ever be a doubt in your mind that He's not using you to reach people, even if it was just me reading the book and being able to relate to the darkness and the happiness and everything in between. It's awesome.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, man.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Peace.